want to shift the focus of the conversation to talk about how self-compassion might be relevant for dealing with burnout. Anyone here ever experience any burnout? Right? Okay. So this is one of the areas where I think self-compassion can have huge impacts. And I think also particularly for, well, really for anyone, healthcare professionals, parents, and also teachers, really people who are in the caregiving profession. And of course, being an educator is one form of being a caregiver. So again, I don't need to tell you that teachers talk all the time, and administrators as well, about the incredible pressures of the job. It's funny, I find this over and over again when I teach workshops, that often the people who are the most giving, caring people, like nurses, like teachers, people who've devoted their lives to helping others, they're often so incredibly self-critical, and often self-critical for maybe not doing enough. I should be doing more, or I should be making more of an impact than I am. So this self-criticism can really exacerbate the stress and burnout felt by educators. And of course also, the stresses of I don't know if anyone knows that classroom on the left, but it's funny when you do Google searches. This is classroom out of control. That's what I got. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but in all the paperwork, you give in as an administrator or as a teacher, there's just a lot of stress and frustration involved in being in education. And of course, it's not even just the stress of the job itself. This also applies somewhat to educators. It's talked about more in terms of caregivers, but there's something called secondary traumatic stress. How many of you know what that is, secondary traumatic stress? The idea is, and it's often talked about with people like first responders who come to a scene of an accident, or maybe doctors dealing with traumatic injuries, or even like therapists hearing trauma stories. The idea is when we are exposed to other people's pain, emotional pain and difficulty, we actually resonate with that pain and feel some of it ourselves. And I think, or maybe I should ask the question, and I'm assuming that can also happen in educational settings. If you're working with kids coming from a lot of stress or traumatic background, if you're exposed to it day by day, you're picking up on some of that stress as well. It's another way we get stressed. And I won't go into this too much. Maybe Rick Hansen talked about it, but we've got this mirror neuron system where our brains actually register, right, the stress of other people. So there are a lot of sources of stress as an educator, or as a caregiver more generally. And so kind of the question is, how do we deal with it? By the way, this says, I'm afraid you failed your stress test, right? Okay, so what do we do to deal with stress and burnout? So what are some of the advice you get given as an educator for dealing with stress and burnout?
I get given the advice all the time to leave work at a reasonable time.
Right, okay, so leave on time, don't stay too late.
Don't work through your lunch break. Time to eat lunch.
Right, don't work through your lunch break.
One that I think really has a negative effect is we get told to separate our work self and our home self.
Right, okay, so kind of keep a professional distance, something like that. Can you tell me why you think it has a negative effect?
I think that I'll only speak for myself. I think that keeping myself completely separate from my interactions with my kids and not sharing who I am as an individual with my kids makes their learning more sterile, less authentic,
Right.
and my teaching less effective.
Okay, thank you.
And plus it lessens my personal satisfaction.
Okay, good. Yeah. Blonde hair, yeah.
Not to take the kids' trauma and problems and stuff home with you.
Okay, similar,
Not that I do this, but, eat well, sleep enough, exercise frequently.
Right. Okay, so these are These are two of the main strategies that are talked about. The first kind of comes broadly under self-care that you were talking about. No one mentioned the glass of red wine, which is my favorite self-care strategy, right? So basically, self-care, taking care of yourself, seeing friends, don't stay too late, make sure you eat. And again, this is a really great strategy, especially the red wine strategy, and no problems. There's one limitation to this strategy, though. Actually, there's a few, but it's not like a downside. It's just a limitation. It can only go so far. And what might that be in terms of dealing with on-the-job stress? Yeah.
You're kind of not dealing with the root issues, or kind of like pacifying some of the emotions.
Right, so it's kind of like you're doing it, self-medication, or you're kind of maybe there might be some level of distraction, perhaps, maybe, yeah.
But you can't do those things while you're at work.
Exactly.
While you're at work, that's why while you're at work.
Yeah, I mean, that's the biggest problem with self-care. Yeah, I mean, you know, you have a classroom like that, first you're like, whoa, time for my massage, see ya, you know? So self-care is absolutely essential, but its limitation is it helps you off the job, but it doesn't necessarily help you on the job. Not to mention the fact that we often don't have a lot of time. Right? And then the other strategy kind of was mentioned was this setting some boundaries, you know, keeping your professional self separate from your personal self, maybe not getting too emotionally involved. Maybe you've got some kids from really troubled backgrounds, not getting too close, right? Then I think, you know, was mentioned one of the downsides of that, articulated quite well, is it can make you not feel as authentic in the relationship, right? Well, what else might be a downside of this, having clear boundaries between yourself and your kids? Yeah.
I feel, you know, the kids that I work with in especially in continuation school want to know who I am, and I think that they feel that they can trust me if I speak to them and tell them about myself, because I heard them giving me feedback, you know, for their teachers, and they said, well, you know, they don't care. They don't talk to us.
Yeah, exactly. So again, not that there isn't some need for boundaries, but it can put distance, emotional distance. And if a lot of us we'll say us. I guess I'm an educator. I'm a professor. I can say us. So funny, isn't it? I just had to clock that. Imposter syndrome. Okay, I'm a professor. I'm an educator too. So that sometimes, it can make us feel a little more emotionally distant from our students. So it's a potential downside to it. So there's been some talk, and I think you've heard a little bit about this, of the role that compassion might play in helping with this burnout. And of course, you know, a lot of the reaction is, well, what do you mean? How can compassion help with burnout? Isn't the problem compassion fatigue, right? Isn't the problem that we have too much compassion? And correct me if I'm wrong, you have heard about this, right? But there's a movement to call it empathy fatigue, not compassion fatigue, because compassion is actually generating a positive emotion. The idea is if we have empathy and emotional resonance and don't have the emotional space to hold the empathetic pain we're experiencing, we'll burn out. But with compassion, what we're doing is we're actually generating this field of loving awareness in which to hold the empathetic pain we're resonating with, the pain of the people we're interacting with, and also the pain of just the stress and difficulty of the situation we're in, whether it's in the classroom or the particular student's pain. And so again, it's like what I talked about before. The beauty of self-compassion is that it embraces pain and it turns toward it. You aren't distancing yourself from the pain, but you're holding it in this sphere of loving, connected presence, which is actually a positive emotion. So what you might say is compassion, when we're being compassionate to the stress either of our students or the stress of the workplace environment, what it's really doing is it allows us to be in the presence of pain with an open heart. Right? If we get overwhelmed with pain, if we get overwhelmed with stress, we are going to burn out. But if we manage to generate compassion, a loving response to that pain and stress, it actually gives us the emotional resources we need to keep our hearts open. And of course, as educators, we want to keep our hearts open, right? That's why most of us went into the profession in the first place. Now, people have mainly been talking about, tend to focus more on compassion for others when discussing the role of compassion in stressful caregiving situations. But of course, my line is that the self-compassion is, equally, if maybe not even more important, not to say it's more important, but absolutely crucial when we think about how compassion can help us deal with stress and avoid burnout, that we really need to quite explicitly think about having compassion for our own pain. And you may have seen this little example before. It's like on the airplane, put your own oxygen mask on before helping others. That when we are dealing with the pain of others or just a lot of stress, we need to consciously be thinking about validating this is a moment of suffering, right? Often in those situations where, how can I help the situation? How can I help this student? How can I, deal with the situation and make it better? But to be able to say, whoa, this is a moment of suffering. I need compassion for myself in this moment to help me get through it. That actually is what can allow us to keep our hearts open and stay in the presence of suffering. So one analogy sometimes that can be used is self-care is like when you're drowning and you need to get out of the water. And you really do need to do that if you're drowning, you need to get out of the water. But self-compassion is like the skill that we can use to breathe underwater. So in the midst of the stressful situation or the pile of papers or whatever it is, in the moment, on the job, if we can be kind and compassionate to ourselves, it gives us this really powerful coping mechanism. I'm going to give you an exercise in just a moment, but just want to make a couple more points. So you might say what self-compassion does is it provides this island of calm in the midst of the storm, right? And sometimes people talk about mindfulness, being with a situation in a non-reactive, accepting way, providing this calm. And it's very true that mindfulness is very essential for this. But I would say, especially when dealing with painful situations, really intentionally adding in this element of love, care, support, encouragement, comfort. If we can bring that to ourselves in the midst of the storm, it will allow us to cope with it a lot more effectively. And the cool thing is, so you heard about mirror neurons and how we're affected by the pain of others. Well, our mirror neurons impact the mirror neurons of others. So if you're in a stressful situation with someone else, a difficult relationship interaction, or maybe a difficult classroom, if you actually take the time to give yourself compassion for this is a moment of suffering, I really need some TLC right now, even your facial expressions, unconscious, will be calmer, more soothed. You're releasing that oxytocin, your body will calm down. Other people will pick up on that. Your students will pick up on that, or your coworkers will pick up on that. And they will actually become more soothed and calmed as they emotionally resonate with you. So one way of saying this is that self-compassion is not at all selfish. The more compassion we give to ourselves, the more we're able to be there for others, and the more other people are able to resonate with our kind of more open-hearted, present mind state. There has been a little bit of research on self-compassion and burnout, not as much as I'd like to see. There was one study with clergy showing that pastors who are more self-compassionate were less likely to burn out from the job, which can also be very stressful being a pastor. And also with people training to be counselors, that when they trained counselors to give themselves compassion, especially dealing with some of the trauma that they deal with on the job, that people were less likely to have compassion fatigue or burnout, were more satisfied with their caregiving role. And then this is a study that I'm still writing up. It hasn't been even submitted for publication, let alone published, but we collected a sample of parents of children with autism, and we looked at their levels of self-compassion and how well they were coping with their child's diagnosis of autism. And what we found is their level of self-compassion was a better predictor of how well they were coping than the severity of their child's autism. Right? So it's really how you deal with the stress that's in some ways even more important to how stressed you'll be than what the actual situation is. And then, so some of you know, I don't know, maybe all of you, or probably most of you know, but I'm a mother of an autistic child, Rowan, and we actually made a film about our journey with our son called The Horse Boy, that kind of talked about how we tried to cope with our son's autism. But just from a personal level, as the mother of a special needs child, I cannot even tell you how incredibly crucial self-compassion was to helping me cope. You know, when he got diagnosed, it was about 7 years since I had started having an active self-compassion practice. And I just don't know how I would have dealt with it otherwise. I was actually on my way to a meditation retreat. And the day he got diagnosed, and I told my husband, you know, oh, listen, you know, I won't go, we'll just stay home, we'll process, work with this together. And he said, no, you go on your retreat, you give yourself compassion, you get centered, and come back and help me. And then, so that's what I did. I just, you can imagine when your child gets diagnosed with autism or special needs, all the strange feelings that come up, like you're feeling grief and disappointment. But this is your child you love more than anyone else in the world, and I shouldn't be feeling grief and disappointment, should I? And so I just allowed myself to feel everything. I didn't judge myself. I didn't try to say what I should be feeling, what I shouldn't be feeling. I just held it all, including my grief and disappointment, in this incredible space of loving kindness and compassion, and remembered that not everyone had a child with autism, but you know, most parents have significant challenges with their children. I was not alone. And it really just helped me cope with it. And then, of course, as he went through, you know, growing up, this is Rowan in peaceful mode, but Rowan in not so peaceful mode. On the top there, this is still from The Horse Boy. He used to have terrible tantrums, like really quite extreme tantrums. And I'm sure as your teachers, you've all been around autistic children, you know how extreme that can be. And of course, they look normal. So when your kid throws a big tantrum, people think like, what's wrong with that kid? And what's wrong with that mother for not being able to control her kid? And what would happen when he would throw these big tantrums, especially out in public, is I would just give myself compassion. It was amazing. I would try to help my son if he was getting really upset and make sure he was safe. But I would say I'd probably be putting 80% of my attention on myself for how incredibly hard it was in that moment. You know, in that self-compassion break we talked about, that's when I developed it partly, was in moments like that with him. And this is a moment of suffering. Suffering is part of life. I'd say it almost like a mantra. And what I found is that when I can actively give myself compassion in the moment, when my butt was being kicked by his tantrums, it allowed me, like I said, to keep my heart open, right? And then therefore, once my heart was open to myself, I could keep my heart open to him and be more present to meet his needs. But if I tried to go straight to helping him and straight to meeting his needs, and I didn't deal with my own needs first, I would burn out almost instantly and get frustrated and not really be able to be present for him. So, you know, whether it's something like being a parent of an autistic child, or maybe you're a caregiver for an elderly parent, or a spouse, or you're a teacher, or you're a clinician, I think every single time we're in a situation of having to give to others, if there's any suffering or stress involved with that, we have to remember that it's the absolute best thing we can do for the other person to first give ourselves compassion for how hard it can be, right? So I actually want to lead us through a little practice that is something you can hopefully, again, use on the job in the heat of the moment. It's not quite as good as the glass of red wine, but it comes close, which is a practice we call breathing compassion in and out. And it's combined with dropping in some equanimity, words of equanimity to help us see the picture in a broader perspective. So this is going to be like a little mini meditation. So if everyone can get into a comfortable position. Okay, so if everyone can find a comfortable position with both feet on the floor so you feel centered and supported. All right, so what I'd like you to do is think about some interaction, whether it's with your classroom or at work, or maybe you're a caregiver in some other way, with a child or parent or spouse, some interaction where caring for someone else was causing you some stress, starting to feel like it was burning you out a little bit, at least in that moment. So see if you can call some sort of specific situation in mind. Maybe it was at a meeting, or one day in class, or one day with your child. Please raise your hand if you need a moment to think of such a situation. Okay, we'll take a moment more, but just choose one. And if you have already chosen the situation, bring it to your mind's eye, play it out in your mind. You know, what was the situation? What was happening? What I'd like you to do is imagine as you breathe that when you breathe in, you are breathing compassion in for yourself, for the difficulty and suffering of the situation. But then as you breathe out, that you are breathing compassion out to the other or others for their suffering and struggle. Okay, so breathing compassion in and breathing compassion out. To make this feel a little more juicy, why don't we go ahead and put our hands on our hearts again? So it's not just an intellectual exercise. See if you can tap into that sense of warmth and care, the warmth of your own hands. And then again, thinking of this situation and breathing compassion in for yourself and out for the other. As we're doing this, we're validating our own suffering and the suffering of others, and holding it all like we're swimming in an ocean of compassion. And as you're breathing compassion in and out, letting these words just drop into your awareness. Everyone is on his or her own life journey. I am not the cause of this person's suffering, nor is it completely within my power to make it go away, even though I wish I could. This moment is difficult to bear, and yet I will try to help as best I can. And then continuing with the breathing compassion in and out. Visualizing yourself and the other, giving compassion to yourself and the other. And once more, everyone is on his or her own life journey. I am not the cause of this person's suffering, nor is it completely within my power to make it go away, even though I wish I could. This moment is difficult to bear, and yet I will try to help as best I can. And then dropping your hands, and just coming back to being aware of your whole bodily experience. Maybe noticing what you're feeling, what you're not feeling, just allowing your experience to be exactly as it is. And then when you're ready, opening your eyes. Okay, so again, does anyone care to share how that practice worked for them? Yeah.
I really appreciated the notion of that compassion being something that exists there that I can take more in almost immediately.
Yeah.
You know, I've always had this sort of model, like I have this bucket that is being constantly poured into everybody else, and
That's
then
right.
I have to go someplace else to fill this big thing up again. And
That's right.
this notion that I can just take it in right there and give it back almost immediately is very powerful.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not a zero-sum game. Right? Infinite amount of compassion. For me, that metaphor of like breathing underwater really helps. It's like it's just everywhere and you're just breathing it in and out. Yeah, thank you. Anything else?
I was thinking about a situation with my 3-year-old son in a like tantrum situation, and when you said, "This moment's not my fault. I didn't cause it. I can't." I was having a really hard time disconnecting from that being his mother and thinking it wasn't my fault and I wasn't in charge of making him feel better, because I feel like as a mother that is my role.
Right. And so actually when I teach this practice specifically for parents, I change the wording slightly. So I've got to say the whole thing. Everyone is on his or her life journey. I am not the sole cause of this person's suffering, nor is it completely within my power to make it go away. Right? So obviously we all have some contribution to other people's suffering, so it might help to change the language a little bit. Because certainly your son's tantrums aren't totally caused by you, right? But so it's not a way of avoiding responsibility. It's a way of, really, it's so important, the wisdom part of compassion. The wisdom says, I can open my heart and I could care, but there's really only so much I can do, and it's not totally in my control. And sometimes the most self-compassionate thing we can do is give up the illusion of control and realize we can try our best. You know, so I will try to help as best I can. But we have to kind of open to the pain of the fact that we can't fix it, whether it's our own pain or other people's pain. And can we come into some sort of, have some equanimity with that, can be really helpful. Yeah.
I was picturing an employee who has come to me a lot with emotional meltdowns. And in the past, I just felt drained by the time he left my office. A lot of times he felt better, but I felt exhausted. And with this, I felt strong. And I still pictured him by giving the compassion to him, which I usually do, but through that picturing, giving that to him, I felt like he was left better as well, but I was not compromised.
Absolutely. Yeah, if you leave out the bit of having compassion for yourself, it'll be really hard to sustain it. But it's like if you're filling up your own bucket, you're not compromised and you actually have more to give to the other person. So And this is a practice. You can even do this, you could be walking down Telegraph Avenue and do this in and out practice if you want. It's something that's very easy. It's also a kind of go-to practice. Because all you got to do is, as you notice your breathing, you're just imagining compassion in, compassion out. It also helps soften that sense of separation between self and others we often have. So again, it can be a really useful practice, hopefully, if you try it out. All right, so we have 35 minutes left.
Can you just repeat the words?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I should have put them in your handout, but I'll just say them right now. Okay. And you can, by the way, I'd suggest playing with these words if you find ones that speak more to you. But everyone is on his or her own life journey. I am not the cause of this person's suffering. You can put in parentheses sole cause, if that helps. Nor is it completely within my power, and we're completely within my power to make it go away. Even though I wish I could. This moment is difficult to bear. Yet I will try to help as best I can. Okay, and if you can always come up to me afterwards if you lost a few words there. Okay, so in our last half hour or so, I'd like to talk, at least delve a little bit into this idea of motivation and how can we motivate ourselves more with self-compassion as opposed to self-criticism. And of course, usually most of us don't like our inner critics. This cartoon says, congratulations, Mr. Meglin, you've successfully removed your inner critic. Like, wouldn't it be nice? We think, wouldn't it be nice if you can just go to the doctor and get it removed, right? We often don't like our self-critic very much, causes us a lot of pain. It's kind of worth asking ourselves, why do we criticize ourselves? It certainly is painful, right? But why do we do it? And even it might even be worth asking the question: is there any maybe benefit we think we're getting either now or maybe when we first started the habit from self-criticism? Like, why do we do it? Sorry, who said that?
It's a push for change.
Push for change, right? So again, motivating the change like we talked about to help us and deal with changes that maybe need to actually happen. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's kind of a weird sense of humility.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I'm not a narcissist because I'm not thinking I'm better than you, right? And there's also, in a weird way, you can't be knocked off your pedestal, can you? Because you're already on the floor. So there's a way in which that kind of gives you a sense of security. I can't get any worse than I already am. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think if you're raised with a critical environment with your parents, it's your identity, so it feels comfortable because it feels familiar.
Feels familiar, right? Mm-hmm. And then also something that happens, especially with kids, is let's say your mother's really harshly criticizing you and you're 4. You can't really say, sorry, Mom, I disagree, right? I mean, if the people criticizing ourselves are the people who we rely on to trust and for our very survival, it's actually less scary to internalize and accept what they're saying than to actually challenge the person. So in other words, we can stay connected to those caregivers if they're being critical of us by accepting and internalizing their self-criticism. And that's one of the reasons where if you were raised by self-critical parents or caregivers, it runs so deep because it actually felt a way you could be safe and connected to your caregivers is accepting the messages they were giving you, right? Yeah.
I also think it's a tool for humor and can bring levity to a situation.
Right. Well, I'm glad you brought that up because when I'm talking about self-criticism, I'm talking about like harsh self-criticism. Now, I think there's other types of self-criticism. Constructive you can have like, as a teacher, giving constructive criticism on a paper, let's say, could be good. Or when you're using humor, if it's taken lightly with like, oh, aren't we all silly monkeys, funky monkeys, whatever, that can be helpful. But if it's like, you lazy, worthless slob, I'm ashamed of you, probably not so funny, right? So but sometimes maybe finding that line is kind of a little interesting. But thank you for bringing that up. I do want to mention something we talked about earlier, is that remember that self-criticism is part of our threat defense system. At some level, we are criticizing ourselves because we want to stay safe. We are registering a threat. There's some problem that needs to be dealt with because it's threatening. And so therefore we attack the problem, which again, as I said, is often ourselves. So how might our self-critic be trying to keep ourselves safe? Like maybe you say, I'm such a fat, lazy slob, I never go to the gym. How might that actually be in a weird way a safety behavior?
By protecting ourselves from the risk of failure and not follow through and being afraid of vulnerability and having shame around that.
Right, so yeah, I might be ashamed, or I won't do it, or maybe I won't be, maybe I won't be healthy, or maybe I will be rejected by my significant other. There might be some real fears associated with not doing the behavior, that the self-critic is actually trying to address those fears, just maybe not in a very productive way, right? How many of you know Marshall Rosenberg, founder of Nonviolent Communication? He talks about this in such a beautiful way. He talks about all violence, which would include the violence of self-criticism, as the tragic expression of an unmet need, right? So in other words, when there's some danger, some need that needs to be met, the need to be loved, the need to be accepted, the need to be competent, whatever it might be, that oftentimes when that need isn't getting met, the self-critic says, pay attention, problem, like a big flashing light, address this problem. Because it's actually trying to point out ways to help you keep safe. The problem is it just does it in a pretty immature way that ends up being counterproductive. But often, in some ways, if you start looking, the intention, the underlying intention of your inner critic can be something positive, right? It can be trying to help you in some way and keeping you safe. So I'd like to lead us through a little exercise that will hopefully give you a first-hand experience of some of what I've just been talking about. And it's an exercise we call Finding Your Inner Compassionate Voice, which is really about finding a way to motivate a change, using compassion as opposed to criticism, while also honoring the way our self-critic is trying to actually help us. So the first thing I'd like you to do is think about some behavior you engage in that you think actually is causing some problems and that you would like to change. Okay, now have this be a behavior, not like my feet are too big, right? But something you do, like maybe not going to the gym enough, or doing something too much, or not doing enough of that. Some behavior that comes up for you a lot is something you criticize yourself for, but something that you think actually there is some problem with this behavior. I mean, ideally you think you would be healthier and happier if you made a change. But it's one of those things that comes up and you often really cut yourself down for it. And so again, we probably have many candidates interviewing for the job. See if you can just choose one. And we're in a public space, so choose something that's not like your most devastating personal issue you're dealing with, something that's kind of you'd like to change, but maybe isn't. Maybe you could be impatient, or you tend to procrastinate, something like that, okay? So I'll give you all a few moments to just think about that, what that behavior is. Please raise your hand if you'd like a little more time to think of behavior. Okay. So now what I'd like you to do is, since you've chosen a behavior that you often criticize yourself for, see if you can get in touch with how does that self-criticism usually manifest itself? In other words, what do you actually say to yourself? See if you can write down verbatim the types of things you say to yourself when you criticize yourself for this behavior. And more than just what you say, the tone in which you say it. Okay, so maybe just write down a few of those and see if you can get in touch with the tone of your inner voice, your inner critic. So now I'd like you to think about and then write down, what's the impact of this on you? How does this criticism make you feel? Right, getting in touch with the part of you that feels criticized. You know, how do you feel when you hear this inner criticism? What impact does it have? Okay, so now what I'd like you to do is to become a little curious and think about, is there any way in which your inner critic might be trying to help you? Right? Is there any way it's maybe trying to keep you safe by pointing out some danger, you know, showing you something you really need to pay attention to, otherwise harm could befall you? Right? Is there any kind of need your self-critic is trying to fulfill, a need for safety or acceptance? You may not even know for sure, but just become curious. How might it be trying to actually help you? By the way, I'm not saying it is helping you. Maybe its intention, its underlying intention, how it might be trying to help you, even if the end result is just the opposite. Okay. Please raise your hand if you need a little more time to figure out what this thing, okay. Remember again how it might be trying to help you even if it's doing it so in an unproductive, inefficient manner. What might be its possible motivation here? Now what I'd like you to do is see if you can try writing a few words of thanks to your inner critic, right? Of thanks for its efforts, even though you're not saying it's actually been helping, but can you actually say a few words like, well, thank you for trying, or you know, some sort of appreciation for that part of your inner critic that is at some level trying to keep you safe, maybe thanking it for its efforts. Just, you know, I see you, I hear you, I see what you're trying to do. It doesn't mean you have to accept the message, but can you give a little appreciation for its efforts to keep you safe in some way? Okay, so now that the inner critic feels at least that it's been heard and acknowledged to some degree, that you know, may not necessarily agree with its message, but you see how it's maybe trying to help. Maybe if we can ask the inner critic to step aside a little bit and allow some space for another voice, right? The voice of your inner compassionate self. Your inner compassionate self who also cares about this potentially problematic behavior that maybe does need to be changed, but from a whole different perspective. Okay, so just for a moment, if you can maybe put your pen down and close your eyes. And let's go ahead and put your hand on your heart or some other place in your body that really evokes this felt sense of being cared for. Maybe calling to mind again the behavior and some of the problems it does cause for you. getting in touch with the inner compassionate voice whose perspective is, in a nutshell, I love you and I don't want you to suffer. Okay, so the part of yourself that wants you to make a change, not because you're inadequate or you're flawed, but because I love you and I don't want you to suffer anymore, or at least as little as possible. So from that place of deep caring for your own well-being, when you're ready, I'd like you to write some words to yourself from this inner compassionate self about the behavior. Maybe some changes your inner compassionate self would like to see you make, but from the perspective of love, care, support, encouragement. What might this voice say about this particular behavior? And if the words are, if you're having trouble getting in touch with them, some of you may have more experience saying these things to someone else. So you may want to think about what you would say to someone else in a similar situation to find the language to express the same care and support and encouragement to yourself. Okay, so if you're still writing, keep on writing, but if you finish, see if you can just reread the words, and can you allow yourself to take it in? Can you allow yourself to feel, to savor what it feels like to be cared for and to be spoken to, held in the tender embrace of your inner compassionate self? Can you just allow yourself to actually take that in? Even if it's with regard to behavior that you probably do want to change. Okay, so if you're still writing, you can continue this exercise at home. I just want to give you a little taste of it. And actually, that is one of the practices we teach in our workshop, is writing a compassionate letter to yourself. A letter coming from this place of understanding and support can be very powerful. But I wanted to get some reactions. You don't have to share what you criticize yourself for, but kind of what that was like for you, you know, finding out what the hell is the inner critic doing and thinking it. And it's funny, I did a version of this exercise for years. I was trying to figure out how to help people motivate themselves with compassion, and it didn't work. I mean, my partner Chris is like, oh, it's a nice idea, Kristin, let's just give up. I had like failure after failure after failure, but I had self-compassion, so I kept trying. It wasn't until we added in this piece of having compassion for the inner critic that then the inner voice could really come through. Because think about it, that part that's keeping us safe, it's like it's screaming because it's saying, paying attention, I'm scared, there's a danger. And if we shut down that voice, or if we ignore it, or if we beat ourselves up for beating ourselves up, the whole thing gets that much worse. So this thing about validating, acknowledging, I love that. Thank you, I know you're scared. Then it can like, oh, okay, you've heard me. I can relax a little bit. And then you can meet the same need for safety, whatever the behavior change that needs to be there, from this place of love and care. So this really can't be overemphasized the importance of having compassion for our inner critic as well. And in fact, it's the foundation on which the full opening of our hearts rests. You can't open our hearts to parts of ourselves and not others. So thank you very much for that. All right, what else? This came up for you, yeah.
As I think about teaching this to other people, especially students, it really makes the most sense in the context of thinking about how you would approach this with someone else that you really care about.
Yeah.
In that compassionate way, like how would I say this to someone in a loving way, and then say,
Yeah, exactly. I mean, most of us have a lot of experience being compassionate to our friends or someone we care about, but we just aren't in the habit with ourselves. So that's a very good tool to think about, just like you said, what you would say to a friend. And I think the exercise on my website, you can write yourself a compassionate letter as if you were speaking to someone who was a good friend, who was going through the same situation. In other words, you use that tool to get the words flowing, and then it's like you tuck yourself in, oh, that's actually me who's going through this situation. Just not to get too off this, but there's a study showing that if you write a compassionate letter to yourself for 5 days, it reduces your depression for up to 3 months and increases happiness for up to 6 months. 5 days of writing a compassionate letter. There's no reason you couldn't have students do this in your class or something like that.
Can you repeat that?
It just, well, you'd have to look at the study. It's Shapiro and Mongrain. It's on my website, but I think it was they could choose same issue, different issue. But every day for 5 days straight, they wrote a compassionate letter to themselves about some issue they were going through. So increased happiness for 6 months, reduced depression for 3 months. It's a powerful tool. Often what the inner critic is trying to do is to meet the need for love and acceptance, right? So if I have J-Lo's butt, then I'll be loved and accepted, right? But then oftentimes, again, the inner compassionate voice can meet that need directly. Right? And maybe in this case, it doesn't mean a behavior change. It means the behavior change is more how you relate to yourself. But you know, sometimes people, if they are really unhealthy in their bodies, they really do need to exercise more to feel better in their bodies. But it's coming from a place of, again, I love you and I don't want you to suffer. And if, you know, I know you aren't perfect and it's okay, accept you as you are, but just like a mother, you want the best for your child. You're going to encourage them. You aren't going to say, oh, just do whatever. But everything can shift. Everything can shift. How many people found that? Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
I never thought of addressing the self-critic with self-compassion. It never occurred to me. Even though I've had wonderful people in my life do the same for me and say, you know, be gentle with yourself and do the best you can in the moment. I don't accept that when I say it to you, but it had more impact when I did it on myself. I just never imagined that oh wow, this is something that was, but I don't hear it from other people. I just like, no, you know, they're being too nice to me. I just dismiss it.
Yes, isn't it funny, like I say, this fear of compassion we have almost, like they're just being nice or they're belittling the problems. But that's again why it's important not to shut down the self-critic. Because if it just comes an exercise in nice and hearts and flowers and sugarcoating, the self-critic will say, there's a problem here. And it's not, you know, and sometimes there is a problem, yeah, but really having compassion for that and finding a new way to get to the same result but through different means. Did any of you find that the language you used really shifted? The language is really different between the inner critic and the inner compassionate self? Go ahead.
It's interesting. I mean, I was thinking about that, is that my inner critic really is alerting me about something that has to change. But the way it was being said was triggering almost a juvenile response in me because it's a voice of the past where kind of like them off, and I'm not going to do that, right? But if the language is changed, I was able to just see a bad habit of reaction where I don't listen, and I'm like, if it reminds me too much of a certain situation.
Right.
And I was like, oh, okay. Change the language, shift the focus, and then you can kind of get in.
Perfect. And I've got a great example as I'm teaching this to a group, and one woman raised her hand and she gave an example of how her language changed. She said, my inner critic used to say, you bitch. My inner compassionate voice said, whoa, tiger. Same message, much different effect. I want to read you a poem that really speaks to this by Mary Oliver called The Journey. Some of you may have heard it. It's a beautiful poem. One day you finally knew what you had to do and began, though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice, though the whole house began to tremble and you felt the old tug at your ankles. Mend my life, each voice cried. But you didn't stop. You knew what you had to do. though the wind pried with its stiff fingers at the very foundations, though their melancholy was terrible. It was already late enough and a wild night, and the road full of fallen branches and stones. But little by little, as you left their voices behind, the stars began to burn through the sheets of clouds. And then there was a new voice which you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life you could save.
What's the title of it?
The Journey by Mary Oliver. All right, well, I want to close. There's a few minutes of sitting, but I thought we'd just open it up to any last questions or comments. We end? Yeah. Special and above average.
Well, I just, in that experience, I realized that I sort of went to like when my critic was talking, there was a lot of shame about what other people would think.
Mm-hmm.
And then in my attempt to like reframe that through compassion, my first thought was like, okay, well, if I was talking to a friend, I would tell them to lean on other people. And so, but then I was like thinking about that, and I was like, okay, well, is that like a crutch, or is that a good tool? Is that, if I'm having a self-compassionate voice tell me, go talk to someone about this, like, is that a good, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, right. And that question sometimes is framed as, does that mean I don't need other people anymore? If I'm self-compassionate, you know what I mean? Does that mean I shouldn't be relying on my friends? And of course, sometimes the absolute most compassionate thing you can do is to get help from your friends, those people who love you. And self-compassion isn't replacing the compassion from others. I mean, I really wish for all of you that you have really loving, caring people in your life that can embrace you fully as you are with love and compassion. But sometimes we don't have those people, or they can't give that to us right now because we're in some conflict or they're distracted. Or maybe they are giving that to us, but if we aren't giving it to ourselves, it's not really sinking in. So it's really, yeah, absolutely. Sometimes getting help from friends is very powerful and self-compassionate. But you know, the thing about self-compassion, sometimes I talk about it in my little book, in my book, as I think of it as a guardian angel in a weird way. It sounds kind of hearts and floweries, but there we go. Because it's never away from your side, right? Your friend, it might be 3 a.m. Okay, you'd like to talk to your friend, but it's 3 a.m. But your inner compassion itself is there all the time, and often precisely when you need it most, when no one else is around. So, yeah.
Throughout this entire experience, I'm like all about social emotional learning and taking this in and how am I going to bring it back to my classroom. And every time there's been this little like whisper of like, well, how are we going to do this for ourselves and for our staff? I've been like, I don't care, I just care about my students, right? And what's funny is I've been attending another workshop in addition to this one. They gave me 3 days off to come to this one. But then I was like, well, maybe I should try to do like a half day. And so I was looking at all the things and I was like, which one can I like skip over? I was like, yeah, self-compassion. Like, who cares about that? Like, I don't need that. And then like being in this and like reading this, and it's like finally really sunk in. Like, I cannot keep taking care of other people and I like get emotional just talking about it, which shows that I need it. But how important, like, because I think all of us do it. I've talked to so many of you, and we just constantly put ourselves behind everyone else, and like you can't do it forever. You burn out, and I turned into this like negative person that I hated by the end of the year, and I just couldn't do it, and it's because I wasn't taking care of myself. So, thank you very much for that.
Well, let's take 1 minute of silence then to close it out, and then I'll let you out on time. Why don't you go ahead and, again, adopt some soothing touch, your hands on your heart, or maybe giving yourself a little hug, or let's just take about 1 minute of silence and see if you can allow yourself to savor, take in some feelings of self-care and compassion and kindness. ready, slowly opening your eyes. All right, well, thank you, everyone. It's been a lovely morning. Hope you all bring this out into education. You'll be pioneers, like I said. People aren't really doing this work in school settings yet, so I take the ball and pass it to you.